The faint hum of cicadas filled the warm summer afternoon as Alex stepped onto the back porch of his sister's house, the screen door creaking shut behind him. He hadn't visited in months, and the familiarity of the scene, her meticulously kept garden, the scent of freshly brewed coffee wafting from the kitchen, should have put him at ease. But it didn't. Not with Daniel here. Daniel, his sister's husband, was crouched in the driveway, inspecting the engine of his truck with his usual precision. A man in his early 30s, Daniel was the kind of person whose presence demanded attention without asking for it. His easy confidence, the way he carried himself with an understated charm, made Alex uncomfortable in ways he didn't fully understand. "Morning, Alex," Daniel called out without looking up, his voice rich and smooth like the bourbon he drank at night. He wiped his hands on a rag and stood, brushing a few dark strands of hair from his forehead. Alex nodded in response, forcing a polite smile. "Morning. What's wrong with the truck?" "Nothing serious. Just routine maintenance," Daniel replied, tossing the rag onto a nearby workbench. "Your sister left to pick up some groceries. She said to tell you she'll be back in an hour." Alex shifted awkwardly, his hands stuffed into his pockets. "All right. Let me know if you need help with anything." Daniel smirked, his eyes meeting Alex's for a beat too long. "Will do." The exchange was harmless on the surface, but Alex felt the tension simmer beneath it. It had been there for months now, ever since Daniel had made a habit of finding reasons to linger when the two of them were alone. A glance that lingered too long. A question asked with an edge of curiosity that felt too personal. Alex told himself it was nothing, that he was imagining things. "Why don't you come out to the garage?" Daniel said suddenly, breaking the silence. "I can show you some of the tools I've been working with. Might come in handy if you ever need to fix something." Alex hesitated, the invitation catching him off guard. "Sure, I guess." He followed Daniel into the garage, his heart beating just a little faster. The air inside was warm and faintly metallic, the walls lined with tools and shelves cluttered with jars of screws and bolts. Daniel leaned casually against the workbench, his posture as relaxed as ever, but his eyes seemed to be studying Alex. "You've never really been the handyman type, huh?" Daniel said with a crooked smile, pulling a sleek power drill off the wall. Alex shrugged, trying to appear indifferent. "Not really. Guess I've never had the need." Daniel held up the drill, his fingers brushing against Alex's as he handed it over. "Well, it's never too late to learn." There was something in his tone, playful, but with an undercurrent of something deeper. Alex couldn't place it, but the knot in his stomach tightened. And then the sound of a car door slamming outside shattered the moment. Alex exhaled, realizing he'd been holding his breath. "Guess your sister's back," Daniel said, his expression unreadable. Alex nodded, setting the drill down carefully as he followed Daniel out. But the tension lingered, unspoken and unresolved. The garage door creaked as it closed, casting the room in dim, warm light. Alex stood by the workbench, trying to steady his breath. The space felt smaller now, confined by the silence that stretched between him and Daniel. His brother-in-law had set to work, rummaging through the tool drawers with an ease that made Alex's unease grow. "Here," Daniel said, pulling a wrench from the drawer and handing it to Alex with a deliberate slowness. "This is the one you'll need to tighten the bolts. It's all in the wrist." Alex took the tool, his fingers brushing Daniel's again, and for a moment, the world seemed to shrink down to just the two of them. He could feel Daniel's gaze on him, steady and unyielding, like the weight of an unspoken question hanging in the air. "Okay, so, I just turn it, right?" Alex asked, trying to keep his voice casual, but his heart was pounding in his chest. Daniel stepped closer, his proximity almost overwhelming. "Not just turn it," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "You've got to apply the right amount of pressure. Too much and you'll strip the bolt. Too little and it won't hold." Alex nodded, but his mind was elsewhere, caught on the feeling of Daniel so near. There was something about the way he spoke, calm, measured, that sent a shiver down his spine. It wasn't the tool he was concerned about anymore. It was the tension, thick and undeniable, that hung between them. Daniel reached out, his hand brushing over Alex's to adjust his grip on the wrench. The touch was light, almost incidental, but the heat of it lingered. For a moment, Alex's mind went blank, lost in the unexpected intimacy of the moment. Daniel's fingers were warm, his skin rough from years of work, yet there was a gentleness in the way he guided Alex's hand. "There," Daniel said softly, his breath almost too close. "That's it. Feel the difference?" Alex swallowed hard, trying to ignore the way his pulse quickened. He could feel the weight of Daniel's body behind him, the closeness unsettling and yet somehow thrilling. He wasn't sure why, but the proximity made everything feel sharper, more focused. "Yeah," Alex muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think I've got it." Daniel pulled back slightly, his gaze still fixed on Alex. The air between them seemed charged, the silence a space brimming with possibility. Daniel's lips twitched into a half-smile, the kind that could have been reassuring, if not for the look in his eyes, a look that spoke volumes, even if he didn't say a word. "You're a quick learner," Daniel said, his voice low and smooth, the words lingering in the space between them. Alex didn't know how to respond. There was a strange pull in the air, a magnetic force that made it hard to breathe, let alone speak. His heart pounded, his thoughts tangled, and for a fleeting second he wondered if Daniel was waiting for something. Waiting for him to make the next move. But before he could gather his thoughts, the distant sound of tires on gravel interrupted the moment. His sister was back. Daniel stepped back, his expression unreadable, and Alex exhaled, relieved and regretful all at once. He forced a smile as his sister's voice carried in from the driveway, but inside, his thoughts were anything but settled. The lesson had ended, but the questions, unspoken, unresolved, lingered in the silence that followed. The house felt colder when Alex entered, the quiet hum of the air conditioning doing little to calm the tension that still buzzed in his veins. His sister was already in the kitchen, unpacking groceries, the clink of glass jars and cans echoing in the otherwise still space. Daniel followed behind, his presence too heavy in the air. Alex's mind raced, replaying the moment in the garage. Daniel's touch, his eyes, the way his voice had dropped when he'd said Alex was a quick learner. Every word, every gesture, seemed to have weight, and Alex couldn't shake the feeling that something was being tested, something fragile and unspoken. He busied himself with a glass of water, the coldness of it a stark contrast to the heat still lingering in his chest. He stole a glance at Daniel, who stood at the counter, his back turned. There was a calm about him, a controlled stillness that made Alex's pulse throb faster. Daniel hadn't acted as though anything had happened. He hadn't acted as though the air between them had shifted. But Alex couldn't pretend. The touch, the way Daniel had leaned in just a fraction too close, the weight of his gaze, everything felt charged now, as if some boundary had been crossed. "Hey, can I talk to you for a second?" Daniel's voice broke through the haze of Alex's thoughts, pulling him back to the present. Alex turned, surprised by the invitation. Daniel stood a few steps away, his expression unreadable, but there was a flicker in his eyes, something that hinted at intent. "Yeah," Alex said, his voice thick. "Sure." Daniel led him into the hallway, away from his sister's view. The house was quiet here, and the low light cast long shadows against the walls. It felt like a moment suspended in time, a space where everything was possible, and everything was dangerous. "Look," Daniel said, his voice lower now, almost too soft. "I know things have been a little strange between us lately." Alex's stomach clenched, his throat dry. He wanted to say something to deny it, but the words stuck in his chest. Instead, he nodded, a simple gesture that somehow felt like an admission. "I'm not trying to make you uncomfortable," Daniel continued, stepping closer, his breath warm against Alex's skin. "But I need you to understand something." Alex's heart pounded. The proximity, the quiet intimacy of the moment, was overwhelming. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Daniel's eyes flickered over him, searching, almost testing. "I'm not the kind of man who keeps his feelings buried." He paused, his gaze locking onto Alex's with a sudden intensity. "And I'm not going to pretend like nothing happened." Alex's pulse surged, the words hanging in the air like a threat, or perhaps an invitation. The space between them felt impossibly small now, the air thick with tension. "You?" Alex began, but he couldn't finish. His mind scrambled for an explanation, an excuse, anything to break the spell. Before he could speak another word, Daniel's hand shot out, gripping his wrist with surprising force. His touch was firm, unyielding. Alex's breath caught, his body frozen in place. "You feel it too," Daniel said softly, a statement, not a question. In that moment, time seemed to still. The line between what was right and wrong, between brother-in-law and something else, blurred until there was nothing but the electricity in the air and the growing ache of desire that neither of them could ignore. Alex's thoughts swirled, a storm of confusion and longing, but there was one thing he knew for sure. The choice, whatever it was, had just been made. The sound of the front door opening startled them both, and just like that, the moment fractured. Alex jerked his wrist away, stepping back, his chest heaving with the weight of what had almost happened. Daniel didn't move, his eyes still locked on Alex, as if daring him to break the silence. "Come on," Daniel finally said, his voice strained. "We should get back before she wonders where we are." Alex nodded, his mind in chaos. He turned to walk back to the living room, but the knot in his stomach remained, tighter than ever. The boundary had been tested, and the result would haunt him long after. The house felt too small as Alex sat on the edge of the couch, his fingers trembling around the glass of water he hadn't touched. His sister was busy in the kitchen, humming to herself as she unpacked the groceries, oblivious to the storm brewing inside him. Daniel, meanwhile, had settled in a chair across the room, his posture relaxed, but his eyes too sharp, too calculating. Alex couldn't focus. Every word his sister spoke, every casual gesture, seemed to vibrate in the background of his thoughts, muffled and distant. His mind was still back in the hallway, locked in the moment when Daniel had reached for him, his grip firm and unyielding, his words a challenge and a promise all at once. The sound of a chair scraping the floor jolted Alex from his thoughts. Daniel had stood up and was walking toward the kitchen, his stride easy, unhurried. There was no trace of what had transpired between them. To Alex, it felt as though the world had tilted off its axis, leaving him suspended in a state of confusion and guilt. His sister called from the kitchen, her voice light. "Everything okay, you two? You've been awfully quiet." Alex quickly glanced at Daniel, who met his gaze for just a second, enough to send a shiver down Alex's spine. Daniel's lips curled into a faint smile, a look that was entirely too knowing. "Yeah, just talking shop," Daniel said, his voice smooth, without a trace of discomfort. "Nothing to worry about." Alex could feel his pulse racing again. His throat felt tight. He nodded, forcing a smile, but inside, everything was unraveling. The tension between him and Daniel hadn't disappeared. If anything, it had only deepened. His sister returned to the living room with a cup of tea for Daniel, and the normalcy of the scene only made Alex feel more out of place. She was happy, oblivious, her laughter ringing in the air like a song he couldn't quite join in on. The minutes ticked by, each one stretching longer than the last. Alex didn't know how much longer he could pretend that everything was fine. He didn't know what he wanted, whether to forget it all, to confront Daniel, or to leave and never come back. But there was something else, something more urgent clawing at him, the realization that Daniel wasn't going to let this go. The moment they shared, the unspoken understanding, they were both trapped in it now, bound by something neither of them had intended. Alex's gaze flickered to Daniel once more. His brother-in-law was leaning back in his chair, seemingly relaxed, but there was a tension in his eyes that matched Alex's own. Daniel's earlier words still hung in the air, heavy and impossible to ignore. "You feel it, too." The thought lingered like smoke in Alex's lungs, suffocating and impossible to escape. He had to do something, anything, to break free from the tight grip of this secret. But for now, the only thing he could do was watch as his sister's laughter filled the room, a bitter reminder of everything he stood to lose. When the evening wore on and they all sat down for dinner, Alex's appetite had evaporated. His sister's casual conversation, her easy way of speaking, felt like a world he no longer belonged to. Daniel's silence spoke volumes, and every glance exchanged between them felt like an unspoken promise that neither could ignore. It was clear now, things had changed, and whatever came next was inevitable.